Hello, and today we're going to be speaking about supervised learning in deep neural networks. So why is this interesting for us if we want to understand the brain? Well, you remember from a previous lecture that a neuron in visual cortex responds to inputs only in a particular part of space, and that's called its receptive field. But that is because its connections can be traced all the way back to precisely that part of the retina of the eye. Therefore, it's the patterns of connectivity that determine what each brain cell represents. So to understand a neural system, we have to ask, what's the principle by which connections are learned? So the intended learning outcomes of this video are the following. At the end, you should be able to describe historical and modern approaches to supervised learning, to update the weights in a neural network using the backpropagation of errors algorithm, to critically assess the successes and failures or challenges of deep neural networks trained with supervised learning as models of human vision, and to be able to describe two biologically inspired variants of the backpropagation algorithm. So, in an earlier lecture, we looked at the McCullough-Pitts neuron, which takes a weighted sum of its inputs and outputs a 1 if the summed inputs are above a threshold and a 0 otherwise. Now, the first neural network that learned was called the perceptron, and this had a few differences from the McCullough-Pitts neuron, but the most important bit was that it was able to learn from its errors. So here we can see the dynamics of the perceptron, which are very similar to that of McCullough-Pitts. P1 outputs a 1 if its weighted sum of inputs is greater than a threshold, here shown as minus b, and it outputs a 0 otherwise. However, we can move the minus b, the threshold, over to the other side of the equation, so that now the perceptron output neuron outputs a 1 if the weighted sum of all of its inputs, w times x plus b, is greater than 0. And here we can see that the threshold can be thought of just as a negative version of a bias input to these neural networks. And we can rewrite this as following, so that we can think of the bias as a type of weight of another input where this input neuron just has an activity always equal to 1. Now we can rewrite the equation so that instead of adding up the inputs starting from neuron 1 up to the maximum number of input neurons, we start from neuron 0, where neuron 0 represents the bias term or the threshold. This was for a single neuron, but we can have many different neurons in the same layer of this network. And this is a single layer perceptron network. Notice, however, that these neurons in this layer do not interact with each other. So this perceptron learns from its errors as following. So the error for each unit equals the target, which is a desired output for a particular input. And that's minus the output activity. And the change in the weights from an input unit I to an output unit j is equal to the learning rate times the error times the activity of the input unit. So the learning rate just dictates how small or big an update to the weights you're going to take at each learning step. And we can see that this rule seems to make sense.
So we see that if the output was too large, then the error will be negative, and we will end up decreasing the weight a little bit, so that on the next trial the output should be a little bit smaller.
Likewise, if the output was too small, the error is positive, and therefore we're likely to increase the weights and move our output towards the target. This is an example of supervised learning because it involves some teacher who knows exactly what the outputs should be for the different inputs, informing the network of the correct response. More generally, in supervised learning, we want to use a loss function, which is a function that will just tell us how wrong the network is for a particular training example. And a common example of this would be to take the square of the error. But we usually want to minimize the average loss across many different training examples. And this is called by some researchers the cost function. However, it is true that not all researchers maintain this distinction between the loss and the cost, and some do use those terms interchangeably. And this particular cost function is the mean squared error. So now we're going to learn about gradient descent, which is how we learn to change the weights and biases in the network to become less wrong or to decrease the cost. And to understand gradient descent, we first need to know what the gradient is. So the gradient tells you how the cost J changes with little changes to all of the weights and biases in the network. The magnitude of each element in the gradient tells you how sensitive the cost function is to little changes in that particular weight or bias. And generally, we want to find the weights and biases to minimize the cost. And you can think about this conceptually as describing a landscape where the height of the cost may describe hills and valleys, and the space is defined by the values of the different parameters. This is quite easy to visualize in 2 dimensions. So imagine we have a system with just one weight and one bias. We want to move around and change our weights and our biases bit by bit so that we start to move down this cost function towards the minimum point in the valley. And this will correspond to our network being as close as possible to the target. So let's start by just focusing on one particular element of this gradient, del J, del W. So if we calculate this, we'll know if we have a little change in this weight, WL, how much does the cost go up or down? And we can use this to update the weights, wherein we change the weight in proportion to the learning rate so that we move down this function towards lower cost. Here we see that if this del J, del W, or the partial derivative of the cost with respect to this weight, if this is positive, this means that a small increase in the weight will lead to an increase in the cost. So what we will actually want to do is to decrease the weight. Likewise, if a small increase to the weight leads to a decrease in the cost, this term will be negative and we will increase the weight. In both cases, we should move towards a lower cost. And the learning rate here is important because if we have too small a learning rate, we will learn very slowly. However, if the learning rate is too large, we might make big jumps and completely miss the minimum of this cost function. We want to repeat this process, moving back step by step in the network so that we calculate the partial derivative of the cost for each weight and bias. And then we'll update all of the weights and biases at the same time. And this learning by gradient descent is only actually possible when a small change in the weights or the biases leads to a small change in the output value. Now you'll remember that the McCullough-Pitts neuron and the first version of the perceptron had this activation function where there's a point after which a small change in the input will lead to a big change in the output from 0 to 1. So gradient descent is not possible with this function. However, people in machine learning these days commonly use other activation functions such as the sigmoid or the ReLU. By convention, when the ReLU is equal to exactly 0, we set the derivative equal to 0. And therefore, both the sigmoid and the ReLU are differentiable, which means that you can use gradient descent. So please turn to Blackboard and take the first quiz question. Now we're going to move on to backpropagation, which is a method used by modern machine learning algorithms to figure out the gradient. And we're going to focus on a very simple neural network example here. This neural network is just a chain of units, each of which contains a single weighted input from the layer below and also has a bias term. And we're going to compare our output from the final layer, the activity AL, to a target Y. We're going to start by looking at the loss of this network for a particular training example 0. And we're going to use this squared error loss function. And remember that the activity in the final layer AL is just a weighted sum of the input from the previous layer plus the bias put through a nonlinear activation function like a ReLU or a sigmoid. It's going to be easier for us if we call everything within this parenthesis here ZL. And our goal is to find out how sensitive the loss function is to changes in each of the weights and biases in the system. And in particular, we're interested in which changes to these parameters will cause the biggest decrease in the loss. We can think about this network as involving a chain of dependencies so that the activity in the final layer, AL, depends on the summed weighted inputs and bias term, ZL. ZL, in turn, depends on the weights from the previous layer, the activity of the previous layer unit, and the bias term. The loss, J, in turn, depends on the activity of the final layer, as well as the target, Y. Our first goal is to discover what is the change in the loss in response to a small change in the weight for the final layer inputs. And this is the partial derivative of the loss with respect to the final weight, del J, del W. However, we can see that there are multiple steps to get from the weight all the way to the loss. So we can solve this by first asking how ZL changes with a little nudge to WL. After that, we ask how AL changes with a little change to ZL. And finally, how the loss J changes in response to a little change in AL. And if we multiply these three things together, we will get this partial derivative of the loss with respect to W. And this is just the chain rule from calculus. So now we're going to go through one example, step by step, of applying backpropagation to this simple neural network. On the left, we have the partial derivatives that we're going to calculate, and on the right, we have the things that we need to differentiate. So let's start with the loss, J0, and work our way backwards from the loss all the way to this weight, WL. So to differentiate this loss with respect to AL, we get 2 times AL minus Y. Next, we want to calculate the partial derivative of AL with respect to ZL. And remember that AL is just a nonlinear activation function of ZL. So this will depend on whether F is a ReLU or a sigmoid. Del A del Z is equal to the derivative of this function. Finally, del Z del W is calculated, remembering that ZL is equal to WL times AL minus 1 plus B. And if we differentiate this with respect to WL, we will get AL minus 1. So if we put all this together, we have the partial derivative of the loss with respect to this weight WL. And one thing to notice here is that how much the change to the weight influences the loss does depend on activity in the previous layer. What we usually really want to find out is the partial derivative of the cost function, that is the loss over all of the training examples, and how this changes with a little change in a particular weight. So we have to add up these partial derivatives we just calculated across all of the training examples. And all of that just allows us to fill in one particular term in this gradient. So we have to repeat this process with all of the other parameters in the system, that is all of the other biases and the weights. However, once you've calculated the first partial derivative, the rest is quite simple. For example, if we calculate how the loss here changes with a little change in the bias, the steps are very similar. We see that two of the terms are exactly the same, and we just need to calculate the partial derivative of Z with respect to the bias. The partial derivative of Z with respect to the bias is just equal to 1. We can also calculate the partial derivative of the loss with respect to the activity in the previous layer. Of course, we cannot directly change the activity in the previous layer, but once we've calculated this, we can continue the process to move on to weights and biases in previous layers. So here we see that again, two of the terms are exactly the same. we need to calculate the partial derivative of ZL with respect to the activity in layer L-1. And we can see that the partial derivative here of ZL is just going to be WL. So here we see that in order to move our errors back down the network, we need to reuse the weights that were used to propagate activity up the network. So please go to Blackboard and take the second quiz question. So deep neural networks, such as deep convolutional neural networks that are trained with this backpropagation of errors algorithm, also known as backprop, have had some real successes at explaining aspects of neural activity data. A remarkable result from Dan Yammans and Jim DiCarlo showed that deep neural networks that are trained with backprop, that are trained in particular to perform well on object recognition tasks, also better predict cortical spiking data. So first they compared many different deep neural networks on their performance in a categorization task, which was an object recognition task. Then they compared the activity in different layers of these networks to activity that they recorded from along the monkey cortex. And they were particularly interested in area IT. And area IT is one of the highest areas in the visual hierarchy for object recognition in the brain. Here they were studying the monkey brain, and this was particularly interesting because previously they were quite good models of early parts of the visual system, but models were much worse at explaining neural activity in these higher parts of the cortex. And what they found remarkably was networks that performed very well on the object recognition task that were not created to explain neural data also did extremely well at predicting neural activity in these higher object recognition brain areas, such as IT. Here on the x-axis, we can see the performance of the neural network on the object recognition task, and on the y-axis, we see how well it can predict the neural activity from this area IT of the monkey brain. However, deep learning, and in particular the backpropagation algorithm, has received quite a lot of criticism over the years as a model for learning in the brain. And there are several reasons for this. One of the reasons is that in order to send the errors backwards from the top layer back down to the earlier layers, we need to reuse weights that were initially used to propagate activity up the network from the earlier layers to the deeper layers. And this requires a kind of symmetry of connectivity in two directions, from one layer to a higher layer and from the higher layer back, that seems rather unusual in the brain. If we would have continued this backpropagation of our example a little further, we would have seen that in order to update weights at an earlier stage in the network, we would have needed information on weights at higher levels of the network. And this weight update, depending on information on connections between distant neurons, this doesn't seem to be something that is generally considered possible in the brain. And in the brain, all learning is thought to happen based on local information that the neuron can access. And another criticism is that these networks act in two stages, one where they propagate activity and predict, and a second stage where they stop and learn. However, in the brain, there is not a clear separation between acting and learning as in deep neural networks. However, there have been some very interesting proposals to suggest how the brain could approximate something like the backpropagation algorithm. And this paper by Lillicrap and colleagues attempted to tackle this first issue that we raised, which is the reuse of the weights so that you have symmetric weights in the forward propagating and back propagating direction. As we said, this is something that seems very rare in the brain, but remarkably, what Lillicrap and colleagues showed was that if you replace the weights in the backward direction so that they're no longer a copy of the original weights, and you replace them by random connections, this network can still learn remarkably well. In fact, it learns on some tasks at a rate that is similar to the full backpropagation algorithm. This seems rather counterintuitive, but they showed that the way this happens is that if you set random weights in the feedback direction, information about these feedback weights can eventually be transferred to the feed-forward weights. And the feed-forward weights are gradually learned so that they approach the feedback weights. So you end up getting something that looks very similar to the full backprop algorithm. Another exciting proposal in order to tackle other criticisms of the backprop algorithm is based on some intriguing aspects of real neuroanatomy and how neurons seem to communicate across different stages of the cortical hierarchy. In order to understand this, let's go back and remind ourselves of some of the anatomy of excitatory neurons, and in particular the most common type of excitatory neuron in the cortex, called the pyramidal cell. This pyramidal cell has a cell body, also known as a soma, which integrates inputs from all of the dendrites. It also has proximal dendrites that receive feed-forward inputs from layers below or lower parts of the cortical hierarchy. And it has distal dendrites that receive inputs from areas that are higher up the hierarchy. So Sacramento and colleagues, including Rui Pantecosta, who was recently at Bristol, they took these aspects of neuroanatomy as inspiration to make some neurobiologically informed adaptations to the backprop algorithm. Here we can see neurons in 3 layers. We can see that this feedback targets a dendritic compartment of this pyramidal cell in the middle layer. The feedback also targets an inhibitory neuron, and we also see local connections from this neuron in the hidden layer to the dendrite via an inhibitory neuron. One of the interesting things of this network is that when it converges to an equilibrium, the errors end up encoded in the dendrites of these pyramidal cells. And the learning rule is as follows. Say we want to learn this weight W1 from the lower layer into this middle layer. Well, we update that according to a learning rate, and it also depends on firing rate input from the lower area and a difference in the voltage between 2 compartments of the pyramidal cell, which we can call here, for example, the dendrite and the cell body. So here we can see that a single neuron in the network is used simultaneously to propagate activity up the network, and this occurs at the cell body. It also encodes errors at the dendrites and propagates errors from the dendrites to the cell body. Also, remarkably, it does this propagation of activity and learning at the same time, unlike the normal backpropagation algorithm. Also, one important thing to notice here is that the learning rule depends entirely on information that a single neuron should have available. This includes inputs from lower areas and differences in activity or voltage between 2 compartments of the cell. And as I said, a lot of this work is done by and continued in very exciting directions from Rui Pantecosta's lab, and many of his lab, including wonderful people named here, are still at Bristol. So if you're interested, please go and find these people. So please go to the blackboard and answer the final quiz question. So I think most people will agree that deep neural networks are incredibly exciting, and also their application to understand the brain may be a very promising way forward. However, there do remain serious criticisms. A lot of these have been laid out. A very important and highly influential commentary piece by Jeff Bowers and colleagues here at the University of Bristol. They acknowledge that deep neural networks in many cases do the best job at predicting brain signals in response to images taken from brain data sets. However, these behavioral and brain data sets do not test hypotheses regarding what features are contributing to good predictions. We do not know in most cases if the deep neural networks are, for example, successfully recognizing objects in the same way that humans do. And in particular, there is some evidence that in many cases they do not. Here's an example where Garris and colleagues used a style transfer algorithm to overlay a picture of a cat with the texture of an elephant's skin. Now, most humans, if asked to classify this, would say that this is a cat, perhaps with some doubt. However, a deep neural network classifies this with quite a lot of confidence as an Indian elephant. So this shows that in many cases, state-of-the-art deep and convolutional neural networks focus on aspects of objects such as the texture, which are less relevant for object classification for humans. Humans, we usually focus on aspects like the global shape of an object. Now, here's another example from Baker and colleagues where they made some changes to an image of a camel, and they found that if they changed the anatomy of the camel drastically in such a way that it may be difficult for a human to classify, the deep neural networks were still able to classify this as a camel with a lot of confidence. However, if they made very small local changes to the shape of the camel drawing, the neural networks were no longer able to recognize this as a camel, even though humans would be able to do this very easily. So this suggests that in many cases the features that deep neural networks use to solve the problem are not the same as the ones that humans use. And more generally, a worrying take-home message from Bowers and colleagues is that deep neural networks seem to account for almost no results from psychological research, including a deep literature on psychological research of human vision processing. So, to recap, supervised learning is learning from feedback, and a particular type of feedback where a teacher informs us exactly what our response should have been. We touched on single-layer perceptron networks as the first learning neural networks. We found out how the gradient tells us how sensitive the cost is to changes to individual weights and biases, and this can also be thought of as the direction and rate of increase of the cost function in a space defined by the weights and biases. We covered gradient descent, which is a method to find the local minimum of the cost function. However, we noted that it only works if the activation function can be differentiated, such that a small change to the input will lead to a small change in the output. We went over the backpropagation of error algorithm, or backprop, and we saw how this uses the chain rule of calculus to calculate the gradient with respect to all of the weights and biases in the network, and then uses this to update the weights. We saw that remarkably, the deep neural networks trained with backprop that perform best on object recognition tasks also are the ones that do best at predicting neural activity in corresponding regions of the brain. However, we saw several criticisms for why standard backprop is not considered biologically realistic. We also learned a couple of biologically inspired variants of backprop that have been quite successful at performing object recognition tasks to a high degree of accuracy. However, we saw that deep neural networks, even very successful ones, often do not seem to solve these image recognition tasks in the same way that humans do. I hope you enjoyed this dive into supervised learning and deep networks and comparison with the brain. There are some really nice references, some of which are really very readable here if you want to learn more. Thank you.